What is up, everybody? Today I'm back with another winter botany lesson, this time on how to identify members of the genus Rosa, or roses as they're commonly called in the wintertime. So let's get started. Now right here we have a big thicket of roses growing. And there's really three features that make roses easy to identify in the winter. Number one is their growth form. They are shrubs typically, so don't get too big or too large. And in particular we have these really thick sort of vines that they develop that just grow every which way. You can see here this is a whole big pile of branches that's just developed over the years from the roses just continue to grow in the same spot. Also important is the thorns, or actually prickles I should call them. There is a difference between thorns, spines, and prickles growing all up and down the stem. That's a really good feature to identify them by, as everyone should know, I think. And finally, the most important one perhaps is the hips, the accessory fruit, which you can see an example of right here. Note also I do say accessory fruit and not the true fruit. There is a difference in this case. And the hips always look red like this, or maybe purple, and you often have these little sepals hanging out the end, the old sepals, that brown part right there, and that makes them really easy to identify as rose hips. So all these three features together should give you a very solid basis to identify roses in the wintertime. Now I could just end the video right here, but I want to talk more about the limits of identifying plants in the wintertime, because many people want to identify plants down to the species level, but that's just not always possible in winter, but sometimes it can be. This plant right here, for instance, is Rosa woodsii. It is a native member of the rose genus that is found all throughout the Intermountain West. The other species I showed you is some unidentifiable one that I just can't really identify in the wintertime. You need to see the leaves of roses typically to identify in the winter, but not with this one, because it's got a few features that make it stand out from the rest. Firstly, the hips, which you can see right here, are differently shaped. They're more fat, and they're about only 1/3 of an inch in diameter, or 5 to 10 millimeters for the metrically inclined. Secondly, it has a very different growth pattern. You see the whole plant here looks a lot more shrubby, less of a sort of almost vining growth that the other plant has. And yeah, it's smaller in general too, so that is a good way to tell it apart as well. It also doesn't ever have green bark in the winter, I've noticed. It's always this red color. And finally, the prickles on it are much smaller and reduced, and when they sometimes absent, and when they do have them, they look like this sort of straight, not really hooked, smaller, unlike the really vicious curved hooks on the other species of rose. Speaking of which, what actually is the difference between a prickle, a spine, and a thorn? Well, I'll tell you. A thorn is derived from the twig or branch tissue of a plant. That's they can often have leaves growing on them, not with every species that has thorns, of course, but that's just what they do. Secondly, the spines are derived from the leaf tissue. They can be made of an entire leaf that's been modified, an entire stipule that's modified, or like a leaf bud sometimes that's been modified. That's what cacti have, I believe. They're leaf buds that are sort of dormant and modified to be just one big spine. And finally, there's also prickles, which are derived from the dermal tissue of the plant, the sort of skin. So all those thorns growing up and down the rose stem that we can see right here, or prickles. If I call them thorns, that's my bad. I get them mixed up too. Even though this is a very serious topic that botanists are serious about. But anyways, when they grow on this, like this, on the stem, they are prickles. Sometimes you'll find leaves that have spine-looking things on them. Those would be indeed prickles. And yeah, so those are between the three of them. Now here again, we can see those Rosa woodsii hips, which, and now compared to my finger, it's pretty obvious that they're about 1/3 of an inch in diameter. Now there's another species of native rose that can be found in the mountains, and you can distinguish from this one as well. That one is Rosa nutkana, and I can't find a specimen for you today, but you can tell it apart from this one because its hips in the wintertime will be about 2/3 of an inch in diameter, or 15 to 20 millimeters across for the metrically inclined. Ooh, bit of a jump cut there, but anyways, the woodsii species looks quite similar to the nutkana species, so you have to rely upon the hips to identify them apart in winter. In the summertime, they have differently sized flowers and differently shaped sepals, but really the stems will be looking quite similar, and they'll have the same lack of thorns and being straight where they do, of course, sorry, prickles I should say. I get mixed up all the time. Anyways, one last thing I'll talk about is the accessory fruits, the hips, because I did mention that they were accessory fruits, in fact. And what really makes them accessory fruits is that they aren't entirely derived from the ovary of the flower. Fruit is defined as the ovary after pollination what it develops into, and all flowering plants have a fruit. But with rose hips, the hips you see are also partly composed of the hypanthium tissue, which is the fusion of the ovary as well as the sepals and petals together. And there are quite a few species in the rose family that actually do this. For instance, apples. When you bite into an apple, most of what you're eating is actually was once petal or sepal tissue, in fact, and the actual fruit part is sort of a papery thing you don't eat inside. Botanically speaking, of course, popular nomenclature isn't exactly the same as it is with scientific, you know. Anyways, that is my lesson today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.